But they demanded that Jesus be put to death. But Pilate refused to execute Jesus. He had another conversation with Jesus. And at the end of that second conversation with Jesus, Pilate capitulated because Jesus was beginning to be a problem, threatening his power and his authority in Judea. And Pilate delivered him over. John 19:12-16. Pilate delivered Jesus over to be crucified. All of this happened between 6 a.m. and 8:30. By 8:30 it was done. And the soldiers carried Jesus away. And he was fastened to that cross and was on that cross by 9 a.m. It was a bad Friday morning for Pilate. And here's the conversation he had with Jesus in John 19:8-11. When Pilate heard this, that is, that they claimed that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. And out of his frustration and anger and disgust, Pilate asked this: "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" And in the Greek text, power's there twice. Pilate said, "Don't you understand that I have the power over you? I have power or authority, power to free you, power to crucify you. What happens to you is in my hand. I have the authority." Verse 11, Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." Jesus said to Pilate, "Pilate, you can be proud and arrogant about your power, but my Father allows you to have any power you have." It was a power struggle between the Roman governor and Jesus. Now, when the decision was made at that dinner in 1790, the power was given to the President George Washington to lay out the city any way he wanted to. And he employed a French engineer, Pierre L'Enfant, and he said, "Here's the 100 square miles. You lay out the grids for the streets. You do what you want to." And initially in the original layout of Washington, D.C., every state had a street named for it. That's still true. All 50 states have an avenue or a street in Washington, D.C. But the most prominent one, at the insistence probably of George Washington, the most prominent street in the new capital, the first street put in, was Pennsylvania Avenue. Probably to soothe the ruffled feathers of the folks in Pennsylvania who thought Philadelphia ought to be the place for this permanent capital. Pennsylvania Avenue. Jason, let's see some of it. That's the way it looked in 1909. Pennsylvania Avenue, the main street in Washington between the White House and the Capitol building. In that 1.2-mile stretch, Pennsylvania Avenue is the most direct connection between the Capitol building and the White House. Keep rolling, Jason. Let me see some of it. There you go. The Capitol building on one end and the White House on the other. And it was designed that way, the Capitol building on a little hill and the White House on a little ridge, so that they could see one another. Until Andy Jackson, President Andrew Jackson, who didn't like Congress anyway, and they didn't like him, he had the Treasury building building built on Pennsylvania Avenue so that he couldn't see the Capitol building or they couldn't see him, one or the other. But Pennsylvania Avenue became the main street of the new nation's capital. Indeed, many prominent buildings are located on this 1.2-mile stretch. The museum, or News Museum, the Federal Trade Commission, the Library of Congress, the FBI building, the old Post Office Pavilion, the Department of the Treasury, third oldest building in D.C. next to the Capitol and the White House, the National Archives building, the R.F. Kennedy building, Department of Justice. All of those are located on Pennsylvania Avenue. It's the widest street in Washington, D.C. It's the place where all the parades in Washington are held. From the time Thomas Jefferson, our third president, finished his second inaugural in 1805 and rode his horse back from the Capitol to the White House and was followed by his followers, the inaugural parade has gone down Pennsylvania Avenue. Jimmy Carter was the very first one to get out and walk at an inaugural parade, and every president since then has done so. Pennsylvania Avenue has seen the funeral procession of 7 of the 8 presidents who died in office, and 2 former presidents as well. It's the scene of many protests over the years. It's the place to get attention in Washington when the streets are filled with citizens who want to bring grievance or protest their government. Pennsylvania Avenue is called the ceremonial heart of our nation's capital, and it is indeed the heart of our power. Which building is it along Pennsylvania Avenue that kind of illustrates the most power? Would it be the White House, where the one president and all of his staff work? Would it be the Congress, the Capitol building, where 535 elected members of Senate and House work in a legislation way? Or would it be K Street? K Street and Pennsylvania Avenue, where a number of buildings like this one house 13,000 lobbyists who last year, 2010, spent $3.5 billion to influence decision made. Pennsylvania Avenue is indeed the heart of power. And here's what's sad about it at times. At times along Pennsylvania Avenue, we see power at its worst. I do not know about you. Power at its worst is about manipulating people. It's about coercing or forcing people. It's about deceiving people. It's about saying one thing and doing something else. And ultimately, the abuse of power is about self-interest. I will use whatever power I have not to help you, but to protect me. It bothers me no end that from the time we elect a person to political office, sometimes instead of wishing to serve and use elected power to help, the power is utilized not to serve and help, but the power begins from the day of beginning in office to be reelected to political office. And for me, it cuts across party lines. Both Democrats and Republicans use and abuse their power, and it disappoints us frequently. But here on Pennsylvania Avenue, sometimes we see power at its worst. Now that's Pontius Pilate in the story. Pilate is not interested in doing what is right with Jesus. He's interested in only doing what is best for him. That's a bad use of power. Power or a position of influence in others. If any kind of power that we have, personal or otherwise, is only used in a self-serving or self-interest way, then that power is being misused, if not absolutely abused.